Over the years, many people have asked me to do some more history on this church. So this is in response to that. And we have also had several programs during the last few months that centered on our stories about our faith and how we individually arrived here in Fargo-Moorhead at this FMUU church. We came for a variety of reasons: research, religious search, born into the faith, attending because of a specific speaker, or an invitation from a friend. This morning's discussion may seem a bit disjointed at first, but hang in there and it will soon become abundantly clear. The story includes a sickly Boston intellectual young man, a woman Unitarian itinerant preacher, a socialist speaker in this church, followed by a riot, and finally the demise of this official church on the prairie. Way back in the last quarter of the 1800s, a group of 21 extraordinary women claimed the role of liberal, whatever that means, ordained ministers. Nearly all of these 21 courageous women somehow managed admittance to various Eastern liberal seminaries, but met with the prospect of no job postings and major scorn from their male peers because they were not at home, barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. And so they began to find one another and gathered in Iowa in 1875 to create the Iowa Sisterhood, whose mission was to serve rural churches throughout the upper Great Plains. This was because they were not recognized or welcomed by the male established hierarchy and their rules and control in either the theological schools or in the pulpit. Life was hard on the Plain States, with little glory to be earned by bringing liberal religion to the settlers of the area. Few male scholars from Eastern seminaries were attracted to the remoteness, the danger, the deprivations of the upper Midwest. One of the reasons for the success of the Iowa Sisterhood was the non-academic pastoral approach these women brought to their churches. They sought to make their churches an extension of the domestic hearth, thereby expanding the traditional role of women beyond the home and into the church. The sisterhood brought family matters into the church not only on Sundays, but 7 days a week, with lectures, discussions on current topics, on social events, and classes on domestic arts, all the while preaching equality in all areas of relationships and life. Equality in women's suffrage and social work movements. The Reverend Helen Grace Putnam had previously preached her radical gospel all over the upper Midwest, and from 1889 to 1892, found herself based in Jamestown, North Dakota, because no young men would answer the Unitarians' call to go to North Dakota, since they felt that it was the upper Midwest was just simply too desolate. This dynamo of liberal religion ended up living above a saloon, playing piano in the saloon, even sneaking liberal religion into the establishment's secular activities by singing the liberal gospel as her repertoire in the saloon itself. How scandalous this is. Woo! She did this in exchange for the use of the upstairs hall for Sunday services. She also traveled by rail, by trail, and on foot all over the state. She organized Sunday circles, hosted meetings, discussions, and debates. She distributed tracts and even cared for the sick. She visited single families in their isolated homes, and she spoke to large crowds at, get this, Unitarian revivals. She went wherever there was an opportunity to bear witness in groups large or small. The women were considered, this Iowa sisterhood was considered an embarrassment among the liberal clergy back in Boston, which was and still is the headquarters of both Unitarian and Universalism. They did not join until 1956, I believe. By the turn of the 20th century, society in general experienced a reassertion of male authority, and they chose to ignore the sisterhood in the history books, and their life stories were not told. Therefore, what information we have of them comes from their personal writings and incomplete rural histories. Now, William Ballou, of the famous Boston Unitarian and Universalist family of ordained ministers, was a sickly boy, and in 1883, as a young man, following his graduation from Tufts University, which was founded by one of his ancestors, and at the invitation of a friend living in the Devil's Lake, North Dakota area, and at the encouragement of his doctor, he decided to head west to North Dakota and farm. This picture down here on the chalice table is the only picture that we have of him. It's very small. You're welcome to come up and look at it afterwards. But that is William Ballou. His health did improve by living on the farm, but since farming was not his dream job, he sold it in 1887 and entered the University of Michigan because he needed more intellectual stimulation, at least more than the cows could give him. 2 years later, he moved back to North Dakota and to Fargo. This, I believe, was in 1889. North Dakota became a state in November, I think we said, 1889. So he and the state kind of grew up together. Because William Ballou was outspoken, well-spoken, and inclined to give lectures, he spent a year giving a series of lectures on liberal religion, anti-slavery, women's rights, science, culture, the arts, philosophy, and socialism in Fargo, which was a community hungry for intellectual discourse and arguments on any subject, as long as it was done with civility. This sure sounds like us nowadays. He became an unordained minister of the First Unitarian Society from 1889 to 1892, guiding the fledgling congregation through the process of officially joining the National Unitarian Association. He also oversaw the purchase of this property and the building of this church. In 1875, Fargo's first school was established at this address, 121 South 9th Street. In 1890, Miss Burchell from the eastern United States established Fargo's first public kindergarten and nursery, which was also housed in this school building. And in 1892, the school building was physically moved, picked up and moved to Front Street, which is now Main Avenue. I don't know the address. And the First Unitarian Society purchased this property and built this building just a year before the great downtown Fargo fire of 1893. This fire destroyed a 36-block area of downtown Fargo, and we are just a few short blocks west of where the devastating fire began. Many of the founding members were prominent Fargo civic, business, and education leaders. You may recognize a couple of the following names of these families: O.J. and Mrs. Delandesy, who had a dry goods store; Dr. Ralph, who was co-founder of Dakota Clinic just a few years later, and his wife, Mary Weibel. Dr. Edward and Mary Doctor, Dr. and Mrs. Kent Darrow, Dr. and Mrs. J.E. Gage, the Max Stearns, the Alex Stearns, Thomas Baker, a St. Paul insurance man following the 1893 Great Fire who liked Fargo and stayed, and the Nugent family. A couple of these names, the Stearns families, Fargo didn't have a Jewish presence. They had individuals in the community, but they didn't have the temple yet. And so many of the very earliest ones found the Unitarian Church and felt comfortable enough to be there as well. Under Ballou's leadership, this Unitarian outpost of faith began to take hold of Fargo and the surrounding area. As historian Charles H. Little once said, the church, or shrines of frontier courage, are where Unitarian Universalists throughout the generations have gathered to bring the liberal leaven of faith to the world, to speak courageously to that world of the vision of a liberal religion. Let other churches maintain a faith of their fathers, he said, and we will maintain a faith of the future, dwelling here courageously on the frontiers of the Spirit. Thus it has always been with this congregation, through in-your-face and gentle leadership. When this church was built as a haven for the religious radicals of the time, it spoke of the frontier nature of this place and its people. William Ballou believed that this fledgling church on the frontier was open to almost anything he chose as a sermon topic. He once preached about modern agnosticism. Can't say the word. Can you imagine very many preachers in 1897, let alone 2024, standing in their pulpits to preach sympathetically on such a theme? Yet Ballou did it in order to spread the word that the Unitarian Church was large enough, broad enough, and tolerant enough to be a home not only for those who were seeking God, but also for those who had serious doubts. We haven't really changed from that. People still attend our services to hear such scandalous messages. Ballou was the lead minister here in Fargo from 1889 to 1917, despite not being ordained for the first 3 years. When the National Unitarian Association accepted this church into membership, it insisted that there be an ordained minister at the helm of the newly built church. Remember the Iowa Sisterhood? One of the most scandalous things this fledgling church did was to call ordained Helen Grace Putnam from the Iowa Sisterhood to be one of its 2 ministers. Ballou couldn't handle that. So he then took some time off to return to Harvard to obtain his degree, become ordained, preach in Amherst, and travel in Europe and Washington State, where he met his wife, Madame Ballou, before returning 3 years later. This left Putnam as the sole minister for the first 3 years, aided by visiting ministers at the helm of the Fargo Unitarian Society. Putnam, a suffragette, probably felt that she had been demoted and that an upstart male had usurped her rightful place in Fargo's pulpit. The truth of the matter is, though, that Ballou was already here, had organized liberal talks, and gained a very large following. It is my conjecture that in addition to her 3 years of ministerial duties until her death in 1895 here in Fargo, she taught Sunday school, played the piano, and considered her very personalized style of ministry, both in this church and her continuing rural evangelism. Ballou and Putnam had very different styles of preaching and focuses. Putnam concentrated on peace and harmony in the home and community, on women's suffrage, and a liberal gospel. Ballou was a committed pacifist and a card-carrying socialist. Needless to say, he was often controversial. Now, for a long period of time, that was easily ignored by many people. But the First World War and the Russian Revolution, echoed in the general strike in nearby Winnipeg, made Ballou's radical positions more than some in this community could bear. He was also a good friend of Eugene Debs. And in 1919, just after World War I, the socialist pacifist Max Eastman gave a speech in this church. Outspoken Fargo citizens could not tolerate socialism. They just got rid of it. A riot broke out. Windows were broken, and the National Guard was called out to restore peace. Eastman was snuggled out the back door. I haven't yet figured out if the back door is this door over here or one from downstairs. But in any case, he was sneaked out the back door and onto the back seat floor of a car driven by Mary Weibel, who was an NDAU, which is now NDSU, professor, for a hasty ride to the train depot in Dilworth. Fargo didn't yet have a train depot, so it was all out in Dilworth. Needless to say, this was more than even the National Unitarian Association could stomach, and led to the demise of the Unitarian Society of Fargo. Ballou then purchased the building, which he turned into a music studio for Madame Ballou. She taught music at Concordia. Rooms were also rented to other artists, and noted speakers were invited to speak. Ballou continued to dabble in his china and crockery business in this building that they called the Prado, until he sold both this building and the next door parsonage immediately to the north, which is now the House of Hope. He moved a few blocks away, over here on 8th Street, where he died on May 14th, 1941, at the age of 75 from a lung ailment. How much more information we know about him than we do about Helen Grace Putnam. The Dakota wild frontier was tamed by peace-loving individuals who wanted and needed their churches. They needed their fire department, the police force, schools, and government to reflect these sentiments. The Unitarian Church, guided by Reverends Putnam and Ballou, helped in this endeavor. Even though life, World War I, got in the way of a continuing liberal presence here in Fargo-Moorhead, this congregation in 1956, again, due to the need for intellectual stimulation and a need for a liberal religion, reorganized and is now our beloved Fargo-Moorhead Unitarian Universalist Church, housed in its original 1892 building. The Reverend Stephen Jonason from Argsburg, Manitoba, spoke here on September 7th, 1997, following the repurchasing of this building. He said, "It was a great act of faith to erect this building in 1892. The congregation acquired the land for $2,000, which at that time was a princely sum of money. And then they began to imagine what kind of a building they could erect here that would speak to their faith. They wanted something that would be usable for more than just Sunday worship. They imagined something of a community center, a building that would be a haven for education, for community classes, and for social action. They imagined a building standing right next door to the courthouse would serve a larger purpose than just a refuge for a tiny band of Unitarians that was building it. They actually imagined that Unitarians might be agents of transformation in their city and state. So they gathered to first dedicate this building on Thanksgiving Day, 132 years ago, for they were thankful not only for this place, but for the opportunity to serve the larger community. It was a great risk, a truly great risk for a small religious society, a risk of money and of time, of energy and of hope. Hope is something that we risk. Our dreams of what might be are something that we share with the world, at risk to ourselves, lest our hopes be dashed and our dreams unfilled. So ends my talk, and we do have a few minutes if anybody would like to share a comment or something. Want to do the microphone again? Okay, just raise your hand, Mary, we'll bring a microphone.
How did it get started that the congregation wanted this building back? Like, how did that happen?
Like in 1956?
In 1997, when the building was repurchased, what led to that?
3 years earlier, in 1994, I have to go back and do my math here, 1994, we had outgrown our space on South 8th Street. And it also was not accessible. So we decided to bite the bullet, had a capital campaign fund, and we became homeless for 3 years. Most of the time meeting in shared space with the First Methodist Church immediately to the north of us, while looking for the possibility of purchasing a building or building a church all of our own. The Reorganized Church of the Latter-day Saints decided to sell this building, and we jumped at it. But that was a 3-year wandering in the wilderness part.
Carolyn, maybe you can address a little bit when we added on to this building.
We added on to this church in 2002. Right, in 2002 we added on, we had an addition to the church building, and the back wall of the sanctuary was, the building was only from that wall to this wall, and as wide as it is, upstairs and downstairs. So our addition is everything on the other side of the wall, top and bottom. And we did that in 2002.
I have a question going back to the Putnams. My grandma went to ND, whatever it was, AC or Agricultural College in the early 20s, and she said there was a Professor Putnam. He had a long ponytail, and there's a Putnam Hall named after him. So is he related at all to Grace?
I do not believe so. But that's a good question.
I have a question over here. I'm an understudy at the control booth here. So,
There you are. I was looking all around for a voice. Okay, go ahead.
All right. I'm just, I think some of the questions I've had have already been asked, but I'm wondering, is this written down anywhere? You've got it all in your head, and you've got some notes on it, I see, but is there anything more formal where this is documented?
Some of this documentation was created by a member, Millie Truman, who's been deceased now for many years. And I have built on that and done other research as well. It is written down in the form of my sermons, and yes, there is a written history that's in a 3-ring binder, but it seriously needs to be redone. It needs to, the information is mostly correct, and it needs to be updated, and I'm getting old. And so that really is on my bucket list, to create a readable, comprehensive history of this church and put it into not only our own church files, but also in the State Historical Society. Some of it's already there, but I need to update the whole thing. And if you're interested, there can be another sermon out of this one, taking us from our reorganization in '56 to current. That gets me going, so I get part of this history written down.
There's quite a number of years between when the church was disbanded and when it was bought again. Who owned the building and what was it used for?
Well, as I said, Ballou used it for a cultural center, and Madame Ballou used it for a concert hall. Following the sale of the building after both of their deaths, it went to the Jewish community. So that this became a temple for them, or at least a meeting space for the Jewish community. There was a fire in the ceiling here, and they decided that was an opportune time for them to build Temple Bethel. They sold that. Then they sold this building to the Reorganized Church of the Latter-day Saints, from whom we bought it.
Carolyn, we also have our histories being organized by the NDSU Archive Center. We've taken over two big loads of information, and
Right.
so that will be organized sometime in the future, and people can actually go and
I have to my problem is I have to get unbusy with all the volunteer stuff I do, so I can concentrate on this history stuff, and I would love to. Ruth had her hand up.
I believe at one time it was also a funeral home. There was
Well, Bolger
there was-
Funeral Home had the annex that was once used as a garage. But I don't think they were actually using this building.
okay. There was a covenant that it should always be used for something of a religious nature.
Mhm.
So that any other use that was similar was okay.
Right. No, it's amazing. We get parts of this from everywhere.
So I have a question that relates to the first question. So you said in 1994,
We left 18 South 8th Street.
18th South 8th Street. Where exactly is that today?
It's in a commercial building. Well, the Academy for Children is on the
Oh.
corner of First Avenue and 8th Street. And it's immediately north of the Academy for Children. There was a Barber's College on the other side.
Okay.
Okay, so it's in that block across from the, what was it, it's across the street from Nicole's now.
Oh, okay. That's what I was wondering.
But
Thank
it's in
you.
that block.
Sure. Thank you.
So since Les asked about the history of the building, something that is probably less honorable, so John Hallberg at the NDSU Archives has a photo of a Ku Klux Klan meeting in a building, and he has said to me that because of the distinctive windows that you can see in the building, he thinks that the meeting was actually held here. So it had been sometime in the 20s when the Klan was big, and Doc Putnam from NDAC was in fact a member of the Klan. But I mean, it was primarily anti-Catholic in this area, and so a lot of quote respectable people were involved in the Klan during the 20s.
Well, thank you all so much for your wonderful comments and conversation about